Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was on a wretched evening in March when the London rain lashed furiously against the windows of 221B Baker Street that I found my old friend in one of his more peculiar moods. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing flickering shadows upon the walls, while Holmes stood at the window, his lean figure silhouetted against the damp gloom outside. His violin lay balanced precariously on the arm of his chair, abandoned mid-performance, and his long fingers tapped restlessly against the sill. "Another evening wasted," he muttered, not so much to me as to the misted glass before him. "Our criminal classes appear to be on holiday, Watson." I had grown accustomed to these moods, periods of intellectual famine that drove Holmes either to frantic bursts of violin playing or to the dangerous experiments that left our rooms thick with acrid fumes. That evening seemed poised to drift into one of those aimless spells until a sudden urgent knock shattered the silence. Holmes's fingers ceased their tapping, his head inclined ever so slightly. And in that moment, I knew that the rain had, at last, delivered something worthy of his mind. Mrs. Hudson, long accustomed to the odd hours of Holmes's clientele, entered a moment later, her expression a curious mixture of exasperation and intrigue. Behind her stood a woman, heavily veiled, her black mourning dress clinging to her limbs like a second skin, rainwater pooling about her feet. Holmes, without rising, waved her into the room with the air of a man indulging a foregone conclusion. The woman's trembling hands clutched a folded letter, the paper already softened and crumpled by the damp. She made no effort to speak, her gaze flickering nervously between Holmes and myself, as though uncertain which of us held authority in the matter. "Pray, be seated," Holmes said, his voice soft but impatient. "And divest yourself of that veil, if you please. I find it useful to see my clients' faces, though in your case, I already know something of the story it will tell." The woman started at this unexpected remark, but obeyed, lowering her veil with fingers that shook. I leaned forward, heart quickening in the familiar anticipation that only comes when Holmes, from the very first glance, is already 2 steps ahead. Holmes's gaze swept over her, and even before she settled into the chair, his deductions began to flow, as effortless as breathing. "Lady Cecily Harrowby, if I am not mistaken," he said. "Recently widowed, hastily fled from a country estate. Your late husband's study, to be precise. And you have come by train, though you left the station on foot rather than by cab. There is much more, of course, but we will allow Dr. Watson the pleasure of deducing the rest." The woman's mouth opened in astonishment, her gloved hands clenching the letter even tighter. Watson, meaning myself, could only manage a baffled, "Good heavens, Holmes, how could you possibly know?" Holmes waved a hand dismissively. "Mud, Watson, the precise shade of Thames-side clay clinging to her hem, ink stains upon her fingers, a habit formed in her late husband's study, and the crumpled state of the letter, which speaks to a long and anxious journey. The rest, I fear, is mere triviality." Lady Cecily drew a sharp breath, torn between relief and confusion. Holmes's eyes glittered in the firelight, alive now with the unmistakable gleam of a case unfolding before him. The lady sat rigidly in the chair Holmes had offered, her gloved hands still trembling upon the letter she held. I could now see that her mourning veil concealed a pale and finely drawn face, though her dark eyes flashed with a quiet resolve beneath the sorrow. "My name is Lady Cecily Harrowby," she began, her voice scarcely more than a whisper. "My husband, Lord Harrowby, died 8 days ago under the most extraordinary circumstances." Holmes inclined his head slightly, his gaze fixed upon the letter. "Pray continue," he said. "My husband was accustomed to receiving much correspondence. Some personal, some business. I rarely concerned myself with it." She paused, her fingers tightening around the letter. But on that particular morning, a plain envelope arrived, addressed in an unfamiliar hand. Inside was a single sheet of paper, smeared with a faint powder. He read the note, though it said almost nothing of consequence, merely a cryptic reference to a past acquaintance. That same evening, he collapsed and died. The doctors could find no explanation, no trace of poison. And yet I know, her voice broke, and she drew a shuddering breath. I know that letter killed him, and now I fear another letter is meant for me. Holmes took the letter gently from her hand, holding it by the edges with the fastidious care of a chemist handling unstable compounds. He examined the paper under the lamplight, his grey eyes narrowing slightly. "The powder, was it disturbed when you found the letter?" he asked. "I believe so," Lady Cecily replied. "Some of it clung to his fingers, but the doctors found nothing unusual in his system, no trace of any known toxin." Holmes made a soft sound, somewhere between amusement and approval. "That," he said, "is most interesting." Lady Cecily's composure faltered for the first time, and her voice took on a pleading tone. "Mr. Holmes, I beg you to understand. This is not madness or grief speaking. There is a malign intelligence at work. Before his death, my husband confided something to me, something terrible that happened 2 years ago. He was being blackmailed. By whom? A person known only by the initials LM. I believed it ended, but I am convinced that this," she gestured at the letter, "is the final blow." Holmes tapped the letter against his palm thoughtfully, then glanced toward me with the faintest smile. A plain envelope, a cryptic note, and a powder no doctor could identify. What do you make of that, Watson? I shook my head. It defies all sense. Precisely, said Holmes, which is why it delights me. Before Lady Cecily could respond, Holmes leaned forward, and with that air of detached precision I knew so well, he began to speak, not to her, but about her. You are accustomed to manual work, though you were not born to it. Gardening, I would say, and with some frequency. Lady Cecily looked startled. How could you possibly— The residue beneath your left glove, Holmes said. Faint traces of soil, unmistakably from a riverside garden. Thames clay, I should think. Further, you write extensively, perhaps for personal amusement, or perhaps in the management of household affairs. The ink stains along the inside of your cuff suggest you are left-handed and prone to uncapped pens. I marvelled, as always, at the precision of his gaze and the swiftness of his deductions, though Lady Cecily seemed too bewildered to appreciate the performance. And lastly, Holmes continued, you left Harrowby Hall in a great hurry. Your boots, practical, though of good quality, show signs of recent polishing, save for a fine film of damp clay still clinging to the heel. It tells me you left in haste, walked some distance before securing transport, and had no time for either luggage or vanity. Lady Cecily gave a small, broken laugh. Mr. Holmes, you make me feel quite transparent. Transparency, said Holmes, is simply the absence of misdirection. He settled back in his chair, fingertips pressed together, watching her with that peculiar intensity which signalled the first true stirrings of his interest. Holmes had leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his sharp eyes fixed upon Lady Cecily with that peculiar intensity I had come to recognise. It was a look that signalled he had already formed his first theory, a theory that required only a few well-placed questions to either confirm or discard. Lady Cecily, said Holmes, his voice mild but purposeful, your late husband was a man of some social standing, was he not? Indeed, she replied. Lord Harrowby held considerable influence within his circle. And yet, influence does not always insulate one from unpleasant obligations. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap, though she said nothing. 2 years ago, Holmes continued, Your husband received a letter. Not dissimilar, I suspect, from the one which now lies upon my table. Lady Cecily's eyes widened, and I could see the colour drain from her face. How could you know? The ink stains upon your cuff, my lady. One does not acquire such marks without some familiarity with confidential correspondence. I suspect you handled those letters personally, perhaps even intercepting a few before they reached your husband's hands. She lowered her head, her voice scarcely above a whisper. It is true. He was being blackmailed. By whom? We never knew the name, she admitted. The letters were signed only with the initials LM. They threatened to expose. No, I cannot say it. You must, said Holmes, gently but firmly. A youthful indiscretion, she said at last, her voice trembling. From before our marriage, Lord Harrowby paid to keep it buried. Holmes gave a faint smile. Buried secrets have a curious habit of surfacing when least expected. It was the following morning when Holmes announced, with his usual abruptness, that we would leave at once for Harrowby Hall. I had scarcely finished my breakfast before we were ensconced in a railway carriage, Holmes deep in thought, while I scanned the morning paper with a sense of restless curiosity. The rain had slackened into a persistent drizzle by the time we reached the small station nearest the Harrowby estate. From there, a hired trap carried us through the winding country lanes, the trees lining the road bending beneath the weight of the water that clung to their bare branches. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent for much of the journey, though I caught him occasionally fingering the letter Lady Cecily had left in his care, as though testing the paper for some invisible clue. You have a theory, I said at last. I have several, Holmes replied. It remains to be seen which survives contact with reality. As the grey silhouette of Harrowby Hall came into view, I felt an unaccountable sense of foreboding settle upon me. Holmes, however, only smiled. That peculiar thin smile that always accompanied the scent of a fresh trail. Lord Harrowby's study was precisely the kind of room one expects from a man of his standing, sombre, orderly, and possessed of an air of dignified neglect. Yet within moments of stepping inside, Holmes's nostrils flared slightly, and I knew that something had already struck him. He moved at once to the large mahogany desk, running his fingers lightly across the surface until they came to rest upon a dark, irregular mark near the corner. I bent to examine it, but Holmes was already speaking. Burned, he said, but not by any ordinary flame. He lifted the lid of the letter rack, his expression one of almost boyish excitement. Here, Watson, observe. Within the wooden compartment lay a fine, shimmering residue, barely visible to the eye. Holmes touched it with a single fingertip, then held it close to his nose, inhaling with a look of satisfaction. South American, he murmured, derived from a species of orchid known to precisely 3 apothecaries in London, 2 of whom are now retired. I could only marvel at the certainty with which Holmes made these pronouncements, while he moved from desk to fireplace, his gaze as sharp and restless as a hawk circling prey. Nothing in this room is accidental, Watson. The powder, the burn, even the peculiar absence of correspondence in the wastebasket. Each has a tale to tell, and I intend to hear every word. Holmes's inspection of the study was interrupted by the entrance of the butler, an elderly man with the rigid bearing of one who has spent a lifetime in service. Holmes addressed him with the casual authority that always unnerved household staff, and the man's initial reserve quickly gave way to uneasy candour. On the day before his lordship's death, Holmes began, did you observe any visitors of an unusual character? The butler's brow furrowed in thought. There was one, sir, though I cannot say if she was here on proper business. A woman, heavily veiled, lingered near the gatehouse for some time that afternoon. A veiled woman? Holmes's interest sharpened visibly. Did she attempt to enter the house? No, sir, at least not while I was on duty. But she seemed hesitant, as though uncertain whether to approach or retreat. And you are quite sure she was unknown to you? Positive, sir. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. I have often remarked, Watson, that when a veiled woman appears within the first act, she is rarely absent from the final curtain. The butler looked bewildered, while I could only shake my head at Holmes's peculiar brand of theatrical reasoning. Yet even I could not deny the intrigue this new player introduced. A figure both present and absent, concealed and revealed, whose motives were yet to be unearthed. Tell me, Holmes said, his voice deceptively idle. Was this lady's veil black or grey? Black, sir. Interesting, Holmes said softly. Most interesting indeed. Holmes, having finished his inspection of the desk and the letter rack, moved toward the fireplace with that curious air of idle purpose, which always concealed a razor-sharp intention. He knelt before the grate, sifting gently through the thin layer of ash and charred debris left within. Most instructive, he murmured, extracting a crumpled fragment of paper which had escaped complete destruction. The edges were singed, the ink smudged by heat and damp, but enough remained to make out a few tantalizing words. Regrettable past. Holmes read softly. No further warnings. The mark of LM. He held up the fragment between his thumb and forefinger, the faintest smile playing upon his lips. You see, Watson, there is something oddly comforting about a villain who insists upon signing their work. Lady Cecily's blackmailer, I said. Or an excellent imitation, said Holmes. There is always the possibility of deliberate misdirection, but if so, it is clumsily done. He folded the fragment with care and slipped it into his pocket. Fireplaces, Watson, are the silent historians of every household. Letters may be burned, but their ghosts remain, waiting only for one who knows how to read their ashes. Though he spoke lightly, there was a glint in his eye that told me the discovery had confirmed some private suspicion. What that suspicion was, Holmes, as ever, chose not to share. Holmes had risen to his feet, brushing the soot from his fingertips with a handkerchief, and turned to me with the unmistakable expression of a man preparing to entertain. It was a look I knew well, for it meant I was about to be both amazed and humiliated in equal measure. Let us review, Watson, he began. A veiled woman seen lurking near the gatehouse, a rare poison traced to South America, a burned letter from a blackmailer, whose signature matches Lady Cecily's account. Does any of this strike you as peculiar? Every part of it, I admitted. Precisely, said Holmes. And yet the most curious piece of all is not what we have found, but what Lady Cecily failed to mention. I frowned. I don't follow. Consider, my dear fellow, how would a respectable Englishwoman acquire knowledge of a poison known only to certain remote apothecaries of Buenos Aires? I confess the question had not occurred to me, and I said as much. Yet the answer is written as plainly as the ink stains upon her cuffs. Holmes paced the room, hands clasped behind his back. Lady Cecily Harrowby, before her marriage, was employed as a governess, not in England, but in Argentina. There, her employer was none other than a certain Lavinia Montague. LM, I exclaimed. Precisely. I could not contain my astonishment. But Holmes, how in heaven's name could you possibly deduce her former employment? Holmes sighed, the way a tutor might when faced with a particularly slow pupil. Her gloves, Watson. Stitched not in the English style, but in the looser weave common to the Argentine leather trade, and the peculiar shape of her penmanship, not taught in any British school, but characteristic of South American finishing academies. He smiled thinly. The devil is in the details, my dear Watson, and so, it would appear, is our blackmailer. Holmes stood beside the fireplace, the half-burned fragment still held delicately between his fingers, while his gaze drifted toward the window and the greying sky beyond. Watson, he said at length, do you recall the unfortunate business involving Lord Harrowby's younger brother some 15 years ago? I searched my memory, but nothing came to mind. I'm afraid not. Holmes's smile was faint, almost indulgent. Precisely. It was hushed up most effectively, a commendable effort by the family solicitor, no doubt. But the name Lavinia Montague was not so easily erased from certain circles. Lavinia Montague, I repeated, the name unfamiliar to me. A name that once graced the London stage before vanishing into obscurity, said Holmes. She was an actress of considerable talent, but even greater ambition. Her entanglement with the younger Harrowby led to a scandal most unwholesome, an affair marked by accusations of fraud, blackmail, and, some whispered, attempted poisoning. I started. Poisoning? Indeed, said Holmes. The same hand that once dipped into theatrical melodrama now re-emerges, stained with South American powder. It would appear that Miss Montague, like some ghost from the family's past, has returned to haunt the house of Harrowby. He flicked the burned fragment into the fire. And ghosts, Watson, rarely write letters unless they wish to be noticed. It was during the cab ride back to the village station that Holmes, his gaze fixed idly on the rain-blurred glass, began to speak again. Not to me, but to himself, as though fitting the final pieces into place. Buenos Aires, he murmured. A most appropriate setting for an actress in disgrace. Its theatres have a taste for scandal, provided it is sufficiently exotic. Holmes, I said, what has Buenos Aires to do with Lavinia Montague? He turned, his smile razor-sharp. Everything, my dear Watson. After her fall from grace in London, Miss Montague found herself in Argentina, attached to a small theatre troupe with more debts than talent. It was there she first encountered a rare orchid, prized not for its beauty, but for the powder it produces when dried and crushed. The same powder found in the letter rack, I exclaimed. Exactly. But how could you possibly know that? Holmes stretched his long legs across the seat. A trifling matter of correspondence between botanical suppliers, a paper trail as revealing as any scandal sheet. Miss Montague's order for the orchid passed through a particular chemist's hands, the very same who once supplied Lord Harrowby's younger brother with certain delicate compounds meant to assist his troublesome mistress. I could not repress a shudder. It is like watching a serpent swallow its own tail. Holmes only nodded. A scandal begun in London, buried in Buenos Aires, and resurrected in a letter. Watson, it has a certain poetic symmetry, does it not? Holmes said no more until we were safely returned to Baker Street, where, over a hastily prepared luncheon, he delivered his final revelation. Watson, there is one detail I chose not to share with Lady Cecily during our interview, he began. The identity of Lavinia Montague is not merely that of a disgraced actress. I glanced up from my plate, sensing the weight in his voice. Who, then, is she? She is Lady Cecily's elder sister. The fork slipped from my fingers, clattering against the china. Her sister? Separated in childhood. One raised in England, the other abroad. Lady Cecily's modest upbringing as a governess, her time in Buenos Aires, all arranged to keep the girls apart once the family recognized Lavinia's dangerous inclinations. But blood ties have a way of pulling tighter as scandals grow darker. I could scarcely believe it. But why send such letters to her own sister? Because family secrets, Watson, are the most valuable currency in all of London, and the most poisonous. Lavinia knew precisely how to twist the knife where it would hurt most, within the family heart. I shook my head, marveling at the cruel ingenuity of it. Holmes, you unravel these lives as though they were so many strands of string. Lives, Watson, are but stories poorly told, said Holmes. The trick lies in rewriting them before the final page is turned. Holmes stood by the hearth, his fingers tracing the edges of the scorched fragment he had recovered, his expression not one of triumph, but of quiet confirmation. Watson, he said, do you not find it curious that the letter which killed Lord Harrowby bore no direct threat against him? I frowned, recalling Lady Cecily's account. It was cryptic, yes, but what are you suggesting? Holmes tapped the fragment lightly against his palm. I am suggesting that it was never intended for Lord Harrowby at all. I must have shown my confusion plainly, for Holmes smiled. That brief, sharp smile which heralded an explanation that would leave me feeling hopelessly slow. Consider the facts. The handwriting upon the envelope was unfamiliar to Lord Harrowby, yet Lady Cecily instantly recognized the style, hence her belief that the letter came from the same blackmailer of old. The powder itself, deadly upon contact, yet of a type known to Lady Cecily from her time in Buenos Aires. And the absence of any real content in the note. Why waste such a device on the wrong target? Realization dawned upon me with a kind of horror. It was meant for Lady Cecily herself. Exactly so, said Holmes. The sister poisons the sister, and fate, with its own sense of irony, delivers the fatal message to the wrong recipient. The logic of it was unassailable, and yet the cruelty of it staggered me. What could drive a woman to such lengths against her own flesh and blood? I asked. Holmes's expression grew colder still, his gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of Baker Street. There is no feud so bitter, Watson, as one fermented within a family. Old wounds never quite heal. They fester beneath polite civility until the merest spark reignites the blaze. He paced the room, his footsteps quickening with the rhythm of his deductions. Lavinia Montague, once the darling of the stage, finds herself cast out in disgrace, betrayed by her own sister's marriage into respectability. Lady Cecily inherits the family fortune while Lavinia flees to the colonies, left with nothing but her talent for deceit and her taste for revenge. And the blackmail letters? I asked. A rehearsal, said Holmes. A way to ensure her sister's nerves were sufficiently frayed before the final act. Lavinia was no mere criminal. She was a dramatist to the end. The poisoned letter was not merely a weapon, Watson. It was a performance. Fortunately, Holmes continued, there is one trait that all actresses, and all criminals, share in abundance, the desire to see their work appreciated. Holmes drafted a brief notice to the Times that very afternoon, announcing that Lady Cecily had, despite her grief, chosen to return to Harrowby Hall to settle her affairs. It was a theatrical flourish of his own, baited with just enough sentiment to ensure that Lavinia Montague would take the stage for her final performance. We need only wait, said Holmes. She will write again. She cannot resist. But how can you be certain? I asked. Because the play is not yet finished, said Holmes. And Lavinia Montague has never left a second act incomplete. I could not suppress a shiver at the cold certainty in his tone. Watson, he added, when the next letter comes, I shall be the one to receive it. Holmes had a particular relish when it came to setting traps for his adversaries, and this occasion seemed to stir in him the same artistic fervour I had seen only in his most complex cases. Publicity, Watson, he said, the morning after our return from Harrowby Hall. It is the lifeblood of the criminal ego, particularly for those of a theatrical bent. Accordingly, Holmes drafted a brief announcement, ostensibly at Lady Cecily's request, which was placed in the next edition of the Morning Post. The notice declared, with due solemnity, that Lady Cecily Harrowby, having endured her bereavement with quiet dignity, would return to Harrowby Hall within the week to put her late husband's affairs in order. Lavinia will not be able to resist, Holmes said, handing me the printed slip. The moment she reads this, her hand will be forced. She must strike, if not with powder, then with pen. But will she truly believe her sister would walk so willingly into the lion's den? I asked. Holmes smiled. The human heart, Watson, even in the breast of a villain, cannot resist the temptation of finality, the chance to deliver one last blow. And so the stage was set, with Lady Cecily's reputation and Holmes's quiet confidence as its curtain. The rain had abated by the time we arrived once more at Harrowby Hall, though the skies hung low and heavy, as though the very air sensed the tension within those ancient walls. Lady Cecily received us with a composure I could not help but admire, though her hands, clasped tightly before her, betrayed her inner tremor. Holmes, uncharacteristically gentle, assured her that the danger would soon pass. I could not shake the sensation that the house itself was holding its breath. that every creak of the floorboards and sigh of the wind carried with it the weight of secrets long suppressed. Holmes set about his preparations with an air of quiet amusement, as if the matter at hand were not one of life and death, but some private theatrical amusement for his own intellectual pleasure. "Watson," he said, with that infuriating twinkle in his eye, "do you know what truly distinguishes a successful trap?" "I suppose it requires the right bait," I replied. "Indeed," said Holmes, "but equally it requires the hunter to become invisible, a mere part of the scenery." I did not yet grasp his meaning, but I would soon enough. When Holmes emerged from Lady Cecily's dressing room, I very nearly choked on my own astonishment. There stood my companion, the man whose brilliance had outwitted the finest criminal minds of Europe, now clad in the plain grey uniform of a housemaid, his hair hidden beneath a modest cap, and his sharp features softened by a strategic smudge of soot across his cheek. "Holmes!" I gasped. "You cannot mean to—" "Precisely," he said, adjusting his apron with a flourish. "There is no figure in a great house more invisible than a maid. Letters come and go under their noses, yet no one ever thinks to ask if the nose itself has eyes." "But there is no time for protests, Watson," Holmes interrupted. "If our veiled playwright means to send her final act, I intend to be the hand that receives it." And so, with no further explanation, Holmes vanished into the domestic machinery of Harrowby Hall, reduced by his own design to a shadow among the servants. I could only stand helplessly in the hall, marvelling once again at the peculiar genius of my friend, a genius that could leap from cold calculation to outright farce with equal ease, all in service of justice. The house had barely settled into the hush of evening when Holmes, still in his borrowed garb, intercepted the arrival of the final letter. It was handed directly to him by a boy in the livery of a local courier service, a boy who had no notion that the humble housemaid receiving his parcel was, in fact, Sherlock Holmes in disguise. I stood just within the parlour, observing with no small measure of awe as Holmes inspected the letter beneath the dim light of the hall lamp. "The handwriting is the same," he murmured. "But the paper stock, this is significant." He held the envelope at a precise angle, revealing a faint smudge along the flap. "Our correspondent is growing careless, Watson, a trace of the very powder she relies upon." "But you said this one would be more potent," I reminded him. "Precisely," said Holmes. "A deadlier compound, and one delivered with far greater haste. The performance is nearing its climax, and our actress can no longer resist the urge for a final bow." With gloved hands, Holmes placed the letter in a sealed tin, carefully preserving its lethal evidence. "One does not play with South American toxins lightly, Watson. Even murder requires technique." Scarcely an hour had passed when the house was disturbed once more, this time by the arrival of a veiled woman at the door, her figure slender and erect despite the weight of heavy mourning. She introduced herself as an old friend of Lady Cecily's, come to offer comfort in her time of grief. Her voice was soft, measured, every syllable carrying the calculated polish of a woman accustomed to performance. Holmes, now restored to his usual self, stood at my side as we received her in the drawing-room. He made no outward sign of recognition, but I could see the faint gleam in his eye, the unmistakable glint that always accompanied a quarry walking willingly into his net. Lady Cecily, pale but resolute, greeted the woman with visible confusion. "I do not recall. Your sister remembers me well," the veiled woman interrupted, her voice a shade too eager. "But grief clouds the memory." Holmes gave me the barest incline of his head, a signal that the final act had begun. Holmes allowed the performance to continue for several minutes longer, offering tea and pleasant banalities as if entertaining a harmless guest. Then, with the grace of a conjurer revealing his trick, he stepped forward and, with a swift movement, lifted the veil from the woman's face. The effect was electric. Lady Cecily recoiled with a gasp, while the woman herself froze, her expression suspended between defiance and dread. Lavinia Montague, said Holmes, his voice as cold and precise as a scalpel. Former actress, failed blackmailer, and purveyor of toxic correspondence. Lavinia made no attempt at denial, though her lips curled in something resembling a smile. "You are very clever, Mr. Holmes," she said softly. "Cleverness has little to do with it," replied Holmes. "The ink on the letter matches the formula used by a stationer in Buenos Aires, the very same who once supplied your theatrical company with playbills. The powder, traced through a discreet order placed under an assumed name, comes from a species of orchid known only to collectors in Argentina, and your flair for melodrama, well, that was evident from the moment you staged your first act. There was a moment, brief but unmistakable, where Lavinia's eyes flicked toward the servants' staircase at the far end of the hall. Holmes saw it too. "Watson," he said softly, "be so good as to step aside." Before I could move, Lavinia bolted, her morning skirts flaring as she flew toward the staircase. Holmes, however, had anticipated the gambit entirely. With calm precision, he merely raised his hand, and from the shadows of the staircase emerged a waiting constable, summoned hours earlier by Holmes in preparation for this very flight. "Predictability is the downfall of all dramatists," said Holmes, as Lavinia came to a sudden halt, her way blocked. "Even the best actresses return to their most familiar exits." I confess I felt a flicker of pity for her in that moment. A woman driven by fury and grief, reduced now to a cornered criminal, her final act collapsing around her. Once seated again, Lavinia seemed to sag into herself, the pride that had sustained her leaking away with each breath. "I never meant to kill Cecily," she said quietly. "I wanted her to suffer, to confess the truth she buried with her marriage." "And what truth was that?" I asked. "The child," Lavinia whispered. "The child our father disowned. My child, born in disgrace and cast aside, while Cecily inherited everything." There was a silence that seemed to stretch across every corner of the room. "It was not murder I craved," Lavinia said. "It was justice." Later, when the house had grown still and Lady Cecily had retired to her room, Holmes stood by the fire, his gaze thoughtful. "You believe her?" I asked. "In part," said Holmes. "The child existed. That much I verified through parish records." "And the crime she spoke of?" Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "Some secrets, Watson, belong to families, not to the world." I knew better than to press him further. Holmes's sense of justice, I had long since learned, was not always bound by the letter of the law. As we prepared to leave, he offered one final reflection. "Poison may stain paper, Watson, but it stains memory far more deeply, and of all poisons, guilt is the one no letter can ever truly purge." It was well past midnight by the time we returned to Baker Street, the streets emptied of all but the occasional cab lantern flickering faintly in the fog. Holmes, untroubled by the lateness of the hour, immediately reached for his pipe, filling the room with a familiar curl of blue smoke that always accompanied his moments of reflection. I, on the other hand, could no longer contain my impatience. The affair had played out at a dizzying pace, and I felt, as I so often did, that I had glimpsed only fragments of the full picture Holmes had so confidently assembled. "Holmes," I began, "you must indulge me. From the moment Lady Cecily stepped into our sitting room, you have danced several steps ahead, leaving me scrambling to keep up. I beg you explain it all, from the first clue to the final trap." Holmes smiled, that rare, indulgent smile he reserved for those occasions when I had, despite myself, earned the right to ask for clarity. "Very well, Watson," he said, settling back into his chair. "I shall attempt to lay bare the bones of the case, though I must warn you, the brilliance lies not in my method, but in the simple fact that our adversary could not resist leaving her signature upon every scene." And with that, he began, the pipe smoke weaving lazily between us as the story untangled itself at last. "It began," said Holmes, "before Lady Cecily even spoke a word. Her gloves, Watson, do you recall their state?" Garden soil, I said. You remarked upon it at once. Indeed, Holmes nodded. Yet Lady Cecily is no country housekeeper. That soil belonged to a particular patch, the riverbank garden at Harrowby Hall. From the dampness and composition, I could tell she had left in haste, scarcely an hour before arriving at Baker Street. Very clever, I said. But the ink stains? Ah, those were more revealing still, said Holmes. Lady Cecily's handwriting, if you recall, matched precisely the notes she had sent us over the years, save for one curious shift. The blackmail letters from L.M. were written in a hand that closely mirrored hers, but with subtle differences, the kind that only a sibling raised under the same tutor might produce. A forgery between sisters? A duet, said Holmes, one writing in fury, the other in fear. And the powder? That, said Holmes, was the final fingerprint. A residue only found on South American orchids, orchids native to the very province in Buenos Aires where Lady Cecily once served as governess, and where Lavinia Montague found exile after her fall from grace. But it was the fireplace, Watson, Holmes continued, that gave our villain away with the flourish of an actress desperate for applause. The half-burned letter, I said, with the initials L.M. Precisely, said Holmes. A wiser criminal would have destroyed the letter entirely, but Lavinia Montague could not resist leaving her signature behind, much as a painter cannot resist signing their canvas. The fact that it had been burned at all, and so incompletely, told me that Lady Cecily herself had meant to erase the link between her past and her present. But why? Because guilt, Watson, has a peculiar scent. Lady Cecily may not have been guilty of her husband's murder, but she was far from innocent in the ruin of her sister. There was a time, years before, when a single letter from Lady Cecily had sealed Lavinia's disgrace, a letter which, I have no doubt, still lingers in the memory of both sisters. Holmes tapped the ash from his pipe. Smoke and ash, Watson, ephemeral, and yet they cling to the air long after the fire itself is cold. And so, I said softly, the poisoned letter was not just a weapon, it was a message. A confession, said Holmes, signed in venom, sealed in memory. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the sharp lines of his face softened somewhat by the glow of the firelight and the swirling tendrils of smoke from his pipe. It is a curious thing, Watson, he began, but the criminal mind, when drawn from the stage, invariably betrays itself in the same manner, by its need to perform. I raised my eyebrows. You mean Lavinia's dramatic flourishes? Precisely, said Holmes. From the theatrical ink, deliberately chosen for its boldness, to the veiled entrances, the exaggerated poison, and the half-burned confession, left like the final page of a tragic script. Every action she took was designed not merely to succeed, but to be seen. It is the curse of the performer. They cannot resist the audience, even when that audience is a solitary detective. I shook my head. Surely she might have succeeded had she chosen a simpler path, a cleaner crime. Holmes tapped the side of his pipe. Perhaps, but you underestimate the compulsion, Watson. For Lavinia Montague, the act of crime was not merely a means to an end. It was her art, and like all true artists, she wanted her work appreciated. He smiled faintly. Unfortunately for her, her audience was Sherlock Holmes, and I have seen far finer performances in my time. Holmes had concluded his recital with the air of a man laying down a violin after a flawless sonata. I, however, felt the familiar heat of frustration rising within me. You know, Holmes, I began, there are times when I wonder if you deliberately keep me in the dark simply to enjoy the spectacle of my confusion. Holmes's eyes sparkled mischievously. Nonsense, my dear Watson. I simply work faster than you observe. Faster. You had half the case solved before Lady Cecily removed her veil. I have long accepted that your mind moves in ways mine cannot follow. But must you always leave me grasping for scraps until the curtain falls? My dear fellow, Holmes said with mock solemnity, If I revealed all at once, what would become of your narrative career? You would have nothing to record but my tobacco orders and your own indigestion. I could not help but laugh despite myself. It was ever thus between us, my indignation at being led about like a blind man, offset by the undeniable brilliance with which Holmes illuminated the path. "One day," I muttered, "I shall solve a case before you do, Holmes." "That," said Holmes, "will be the day I retire." For a brief moment, Holmes's playful mood faded, and a shadow of something like melancholy crossed his face. "It is a pity," he said quietly, "that such a mind as Lavinia Montague's was wasted on petty malice." I looked at him in surprise. Holmes was not one to indulge in sentiment, especially toward criminals. "She had a rare instinct for narrative," he continued. "Every crime told a story, every clue a carefully placed thread, each revelation timed for maximum effect. Had she remained on the stage, she might have written plays to rival the finest melodramas of her time." "But she chose blackmail and poison," I said. "Because revenge is a far more intoxicating muse," Holmes replied. In her mind, this was not merely a crime, it was a tragedy in 5 acts. Family betrayal, exile, return, confrontation, and downfall. She saw herself not as a criminal, but as a playwright, and we were merely her players. Holmes gazed into the fire for a moment longer, then shook off the thought with a shrug. A waste, yes, but a fascinating waste, all the same. I hesitated before speaking, but curiosity got the better of me. "Holmes," I said, "do you ever find yourself admiring them?" He did not ask who I meant. Holmes took a long draw from his pipe, then set it aside with deliberate care. "Admiration, Watson, is too generous a word. But there must be something, the cleverness, the ingenuity. Surely there are moments when you respect the mind, if not the motive." Holmes's smile was that enigmatic twist of the lips I had seen many times before, the smile that concealed far more than it revealed. "My dear Watson," he said, rising to his feet, "there are questions best left unanswered." And with that, he turned toward the window, gazing out into the dark, leaving me to wonder, as I always did, whether Sherlock Holmes saw his greatest foes as adversaries or as reflections of himself. The fire had burned low at Baker Street, and our chairs were drawn close to the hearth, Holmes with his long legs stretched towards the grate, and I with my notebook balanced on my knee. His pipe sent up a thin wisp of blue, curling lazily towards the ceiling, while mine had long since gone cold in my hand. "Holmes," I said, after a silence that had grown heavy with thought, "do you suppose it is always money that drives these affairs? Greed, inheritance, blackmail, the usual parade of human vice?" Holmes tilted his head slightly, the glint of the fire catching in his keen eyes. "You disappoint me, Watson," he said. "Greed is pedestrian. Any common thief can be greedy. But crimes born of personal betrayal, those carry a flavor far more complex. They linger, like a bitter draught sipped too slowly." I pondered that for a moment. The affair at Harrowby Hall had indeed begun with the scent of money, but it had ended as something altogether darker, a story of blood turned against blood. I could see, in the set of Holmes's jaw, that this case had left its mark upon him, though what mark I could not yet say. Holmes stirred the embers with the tip of his poker, speaking softly as though addressing the flames rather than me. "Of all the poisons known to man, Watson, none is so insidious as the one brewed within the family circle. A stranger may wish you ill, but only a brother, a sister, or a child knows precisely where to strike." There was no sentiment in his voice, only the cool detachment of a man cataloguing facts. And yet, beneath that thin veneer, I detected something deeper, a recognition, perhaps, that family wounds had once touched Holmes himself. "Lavinia Montague did not invent her venom," he continued. "It was distilled drop by drop, over years of silence, secrets, and perceived betrayals. until all that remained was the desire to see her sister broken. It is not greed, Watson, that I find most destructive. It is the memory of love soured into hatred. I glanced at him, but he offered no further explanation. The poker returned to its place, and Holmes relit his pipe, leaving me to reflect that some truths, like certain letters, were best left unopened. Later that night, I took up my pen to begin recording the case for my files. It has been my habit, after our more peculiar adventures, to set down the facts as they occurred, a duty I performed with a mixture of pride and caution. But as I reached the part where Lavinia Montague confessed her true motive, the scandal of her lost child, her father's disgrace, and the secret Lady Cecily had sought to bury, I found my pen faltering. There are truths, I have come to learn, that serve no one when dragged into daylight. The world would remember Lady Cecily as the grieving widow of Lord Harrowby, not as the frightened sister who had once stood by while another was cast out. With a quiet sigh, I crossed out several lines, leaving only the barest mention of Lavinia's resentment, a grievance without details, a shadow without form. Holmes would not object. He had long since abandoned concern for how I shaped my narratives, so long as the deductions remained intact. And so, with deliberate omission, I laid my own veil over Harrowby Hall, a veil of silence to match Lady Cecily's own. I had scarcely laid down my pen when a soft knock echoed from the door below. Holmes's eyes flicked toward me, his lips curling into that familiar, mischievous smile. "The postman's knock, Watson," he said, "has always been the herald of adventure." I rose to answer, already knowing that whatever lay beyond the door, be it scandal, theft, or murder, would once again find us at the heart of it. And this time, Holmes added, it involves a wedding ring that vanished between the altar and the honeymoon carriage. With that, our next case had already begun. As we sat in the dim hush of 221B Baker Street, the case of the poisoned letter finally closed, Holmes struck a match and relit his pipe. For several moments, he said nothing, his gaze lost somewhere between the curling smoke and the darkened window pane. "Watson," he said at last, "it is a curious thing. How letters, though made of nothing but paper and ink, possess the power to ruin lives. The words themselves are harmless, yet the truths they expose can poison the heart long before any powder touches the skin." I nodded, thinking of Lavinia Montague and her final, desperate act. "It all began with a single letter, didn't it?" I said. Holmes smiled faintly. "As so many tragedies do, one letter written in fear, another in anger, and the final one, Watson, written purely for revenge." He tapped the side of his pipe. "It seems to me that the deadliest poisons are not brewed in laboratories but distilled over years of silence and resentment." Holmes turned toward me, his eyes glinting with that familiar mischievous light. "Tell me, Watson, and you, dear reader, what do you suppose was Lavinia Montague's greatest mistake? Was it the theatrical flourishes that revealed her hand, or the simple fact that she underestimated the bond between two sisters? The case may be closed for Holmes and me, but now we leave the final deduction to you. Share your theory in the comments below and tell us, what was the fatal flaw that truly led to Lavinia's downfall? If you relish unraveling more Sherlock Holmes mysteries, be sure to subscribe and join us again at Baker Street, where every knock at the door could open another case. And of course, share this mystery with fellow lovers of deduction and intrigue. The game, as ever, is afoot.